6 years, we've been talking about the waste. We didn't want the waste to come to that land.
No matter which country you come from, the nuclear waste dump's going to come past your country.
This is an issue not just for the Territory. This is an issue for all Australians.
That health hazard persists for generations, in the case of some waste, tens of thousands of years.
I'll be holding it really strong and standing strong to keep fighting the waste.
You're watching The World from Below. I'm Lizzie O'Shea. And that was a trailer for the film Protecting Manawangu about the proposed nuclear dump at Muckaty Station, 600 kilometres north of Alice Springs. We spend the final part of today's program discussing nuclear waste. Earlier this year, the federal government abandoned plans to build a nuclear waste dump at Muckaty. I worked as a lawyer on that federal court challenge to that proposal. Since that time, the Federal Minister for Resources, Ian Macfarlane, has sought to progress alternative sites for a national waste dump. Dave, what's the government's current policy in respect of nuclear waste?
Well, for over 20 years, the successive federal governments have had an approach which is let's get this stuff and let's put it somewhere remote, somewhere centralised and somewhere remote. Labor's done that, the Coalition's done that with varying degrees of energy and enthusiasm for 20 years, and they've failed consistently. The current approach is that it was going to be at Muckaty. That fell over in June of this year during the course of a federal court challenge, and now the government doesn't seem to have learnt a lesson, doesn't seem to be in a position to review and revisit, and it seems intent on looking for a remote site for all this material. Till the end of September, the Northern Territory is the only place that can make a nomination. Minister Macfarlane has said that from early November he will open up all of Australia to basically a process of people putting up their hands and saying, I'd have waste. So pastoralists, remote Aboriginal communities, local government authorities in regional and remote areas, basically a bit of a race to the bottom. And what we've been saying, national environment groups, the ACTU, a whole range of organisations, including many Indigenous organisations, is that stop targeting remote Australia, stop this search for a postcode, start instead a search and a genuine questioning about a good process. Because what we've had for 20 years is an attempt to find a dump site. What we've not had for 20 years is any independent or evidence-based approach to ask the question, what's the best way to manage this stuff, rather than ask the question, where can we dump it and get away with it?
Dr. Williams, I understand you've just come back from the Tanami where a potential site for such a dump was being discussed with representatives from the Department of Industry. Can you tell us what was happening at those meetings?
Yeah, so following on from what Dave said, there is this opportunity for groups in the Territory to nominate their country as a potential site for a centralised dump for the radioactive waste. A group of traditional owners in the northwest of the Territory have expressed some interest in nominating a section of their country, and so the Central Lands Council, which has sort of carriage of the issue in that area, have organised a series of information meetings essentially. And this particular meeting in the Tanami last week was an opportunity for traditional owners to gather and hear from the department and from ANSTO, the reactor operator in Sydney, what they were proposing in terms of a centralised repository. It was an interesting experience for me because I hadn't really understood that the traditional owners are being invited to nominate a site on their country, and if they do that, they then lose any capacity to change their mind. I found that quite extraordinary, even though they're not being told what sort of package of benefits they might receive and that they can't back out. So
there's no discussion at the moment of what is on offer from the government or the scope of it?
No, the representatives from the ministry were very clear that there was nothing on the table, but they were inviting traditional owners with 2 weeks to the deadline to offer up some of their country and then keep their fingers crossed that the package of benefits would be adequate, because they wouldn't be able to back out once they've nominated their country.
A lot is made of the need for this kind of dump, particularly to store medical waste. What kind of waste are we talking about, and what's your views about the necessity of storing that centrally?
Yeah, well, in terms of volume, most of it is what's called low-level waste, which needs to be isolated from the environment for 500 years. But there's also a component of the waste which is so-called intermediate-level waste, and that needs to be isolated from the environment for really for hundreds of thousands of years. This is material coming from the reactor in Sydney, which has been partially reprocessed but still contains long-lived, highly dangerous toxins which really need to be isolated for a very, very long time. So that's essentially what it is. There's a little bit of radium in there that was used in the medical field up until about 40 years ago. This idea that we need to build a centralised repository to ensure that we have the capacity to deliver quality nuclear medicine in Australia is an absolute fallacy. It's been pushed by a sequence of ministers and bureaucrats in the past, but it's demonstrably false. Australia will continue to have high quality nuclear medicine facilities without having to build a centralised dump in anybody's land. We do not actually need to have our own nuclear reactor to ensure that. We could easily import the isotopes. We wouldn't even have a waste problem in the future if we were sensible and did that.
Tell us, if Bob Hawke is to be believed, Dave, there is potential for somewhere in the Territory or in remote Australia to become a waste dump for the world's nuclear waste. How likely do you think something like that is to happen?
Well, the problem that faces a real constraint on the nuclear industry globally is radioactive waste. It's the Achilles heel of the industry, it's often described as. No nation on earth, despite 70 years of a commercial nuclear industry and billions of dollars and thousands of politicians' promises, no nation on earth has a final disposal point for radioactive waste. So people look at Australia and go, supplies uranium, politically secure, geologically stable, a long way from Europe. That looks good. And so Bob Hawke, Warren Mundine, Adam Giles, in the last 6 months have all said, let's host international nuclear waste. There's a bevy of bureaucrats who feel the same way, and there's no question that there would be people that want to see it. They see dollar signs, they don't see danger signs. What our concern is that so much of what happens with the nuclear industry, from approval of a uranium project through to the commercial and confidence agreements of our uranium sales and the secretive dealing of how we deal or propose to deal with domestic nuclear waste, it happens without scrutiny, without rigour, without evidence. It happens in a culture of secrecy and denial. And you add into that mix the big money, the big politics and the big pressure of global international waste, and it's a real concern. So we are very much, we're not paranoid about it, but we're very mindful of it, and we're trying to ensure that there is the highest level of accountability and responsibility, which is something the industry has and continues to shirk for years.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for on this week's episode of The World from Below. I'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Bill Williams and Dave Sweeney from the Australian Conservation Foundation. I'd also like to thank our producers and our crew here at RMI TV. You've been watching The World from Below. Thanks for joining us.